May 3, 2010. A 911 call comes in from an apartment in Charlottesville, Virginia. A young woman has been found unresponsive in her bedroom. The roommate who found her is hysterical, barely able to speak. Within hours, police arrest another University of Virginia student. His name is George Huguely, and just hours before, he had forced his way into his ex-girlfriend's apartment and attacked her. She died from her injuries. They were supposed to have it all? Privilege, youth, Division I lacrosse careers at one of the country's most respected universities. Instead, this became a case about what happens when warning signs of relationship violence are ignored. This is the story of Yeardley Love and George Huguely. Yeardley Reynolds Love was 22 years old in the spring of 2010. She was a senior at the University of Virginia, just weeks away from graduation. She grew up in Cockeysville, Maryland, a suburb north of Baltimore. Her mother, Sharon, was a realtor. Yeardley had an older sister, Lexi, who she was incredibly close to. Friends described Yeardley as warm, funny, and deeply loyal. She had this bright, genuine smile that made people feel instantly comfortable around her. Yeardley played lacrosse for UVA's women's team. She was a midfielder, number 2 on the roster. Making it to a Division I program like UVA was a big deal. Her teammates loved her. They described her as someone who always showed up, who worked hard, who made practice more fun just by being there. Off the field, Yeardley was studying sociology. She had plans to work with children after graduation, possibly teaching or doing nonprofit work. She wanted to make a difference. George Wesley. Huguely V came from serious money. His family lived in Chevy Chase, Maryland, one of the wealthiest areas in the country. His father was a successful businessman. George went to the Landon School, an elite all-boys private school in Bethesda, where tuition runs over $40,000 a year. He was a star lacrosse player there. When he got recruited to play at UVA, it felt like his path was set. He was tall, athletic, good-looking. On paper, he had it all. George and Yeardley met through the lacrosse community at UVA. The men's and women's teams were close. They socialized together, went to the same parties. George and Yeardley started dating sometime in the spring of 2008, during their sophomore year. At first, things seemed fine. People who knew them said they seemed happy early on. But that didn't last long. By their junior year, friends started noticing problems. George drank heavily. When he drank, he became a different person. Angry, jealous, controlling. George would get jealous if Yeardley talked to other guys. He'd show up at places where she was without being invited. He'd send her angry text messages if she didn't respond right away. He wanted to know where she was all the time. Friends noticed that Yeardley started to seem more withdrawn, more stressed. She'd make excuses for George's behavior. In February 2009, there was a serious incident. George and some teammates went to Lexington, Virginia for a lacrosse event. They were out drinking, and George got into a confrontation with a police officer. He was extremely intoxicated and became combative. He resisted arrest, and it took multiple officers to restrain him. He was charged with resisting arrest and public intoxication. The case was still pending when everything happened with Yeardley more than a year later. Then in the fall of 2009, Yeardley and George got into an argument. According to witnesses who heard about it later, George physically attacked Yeardley during this altercation. She was terrified. Yeardley's friends begged her to report it to the police or at least to the university. But she didn't. She was embarrassed. She made excuses for him. She said he was drunk, that he didn't mean it, that it wouldn't happen again. This is something that happens so often in abusive relationships. The victim minimizes what happened because they still have feelings for the person, because they don't want to admit how bad it's gotten, because they're scared of what might happen if they speak up. By the spring of 2010, Yeardley had decided she was done. She and George had broken up. What's clear is that by late April, Yeardley was trying to move on with her life. She'd been talking to another lacrosse player. George found out, and he couldn't handle it. His friends said he became obsessed. He sent Yeardley emails, some of which were angry and threatening. He was drinking more than ever. His behavior was spiraling, and people around him were worried, but no one really knew how to stop it. If you're hooked on this case and want to hear more stories like this, hit that subscribe button right now. We dive deep into the cases that deserve justice, and we need you in this community. The first weekend in May 2010 was supposed to be a celebratory time. The UVA men's lacrosse team had just finished their season. On the evening of May 2nd, Yeardley went out with friends. She was in a good mood, looking forward to graduation, which was just a few weeks away. She had no idea what was coming. George spent that night drinking heavily. Friends later said he was upset about Yeardley, about the breakup, about the fact that she was moving on. At some point after midnight, probably around 1 a.m. on May 3rd, he decided to go to Yeardley's apartment. Yeardley lived at 222 14th Street Northwest, in an apartment she shared with several roommates. When George arrived, he went straight to her door. The door was locked. George later admitted that he kicked a hole in Yeardley's bedroom door to get inside. He kicked it hard enough to splinter the wood and create a hole big enough to reach through and unlock it from the inside. Yeardley was asleep when he broke in. What happened next is based on forensic evidence presented at trial, the state of the room, and what George admitted to police. George attacked her. The medical examiner later determined that Yeardley died from blunt force trauma to her head. The wall near her bed had visible damage from the altercation. This wasn't a single blow. This wasn't an accident. George also took Yeardley's laptop computer from her room. Prosecutors believe he did this to try to delete emails and other communications between them. After the attack, George left. He walked out of Yeardley's apartment, taking her computer with him, and went back to his own apartment. He went to bed. He didn't call for help. He didn't call 911. Early the next morning, around 2 a.m., one of Yeardley's roommates, Caitlin Whiteley, came home. When she got back to the apartment, she noticed something was wrong. Yeardley's bedroom door was damaged. She went into Yeardley's room to check on her. Yeardley was lying in her bed unresponsive. She called 911, completely panicked. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes. Paramedics tried to revive her, but it was too late. Yeardley Love was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 22 years old. She'd been just 3 weeks away from graduating from the University of Virginia. Detectives started interviewing Yeardley's roommates and friends. It didn't take long for George Huguely's name to come up. Everyone knew about their relationship. Everyone knew it had been volatile. By mid-morning on May 3rd, police went to George's apartment. When they knocked on his door, George answered. He agreed to go to the police station for questioning. In his initial interview with police, George admitted that he'd been to Yeardley's apartment. He admitted that they'd had a physical altercation, but he tried to downplay the severity of what happened. He claimed that when he left, Yeardley was fine, but the evidence told a completely different story. The medical examiner, Dr. Christine Fuller, conducted an autopsy and found that Yeardley had sustained significant trauma. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, and the manner of death was ruled a homicide. Police also found Yeardley's laptop at George's apartment. On May 3, 2010, George Wesley Huguely Fee was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was also charged with grand larceny for stealing Yeardley's computer. The case made national headlines immediately. The media descended on Charlottesville. The story had everything that captures public attention: wealth, privilege, college athletes, an elite university, a beautiful young woman who died just weeks before graduation. Yeardley's funeral was held on May 8, 2010 at the Cathedral of Mary Our Queen in Baltimore. More than 1,500 people attended. Her sister Lexi gave a eulogy that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. At UVA, there were vigils and memorial services. The women's lacrosse team retired her number 2 jersey. The trial began in February 2012, almost 2 years after Yeardley's death. The trial was held at the Charlottesville Circuit Court. Judge Edward Hogsher presided. George's defense team wasn't going to argue that George didn't cause Yeardley's death. Instead, they were going to argue that it wasn't first-degree murder. They claimed George was extremely intoxicated that night, that he didn't intend to cause her death. The prosecution presented evidence of George's history of concerning behavior and his pattern of abusive conduct toward Yeardley. They called witnesses who testified about the physical altercation in 2009. They presented evidence of George's arrest in Lexington. They presented emails and text messages between George and Yeardley that showed his possessiveness and rage. In one email sent in April 2010, just weeks before Yeardley's death, George wrote threatening content. Dr. Christine Fuller testified about Yeardley's injuries and cause of death. She explained how the pattern of injuries indicated this was not from a single accidental impact. Caitlin Whiteley testified about discovering Yeardley. Detectives who interviewed George testified about his statements and his behavior, including how he'd lied about taking the laptop. The defense brought in experts to talk about George's level of intoxication. They tried to argue that his blood alcohol level was so high that night that he couldn't have formed the intent necessary for first-degree murder. The prosecution countered by pointing out that George was coherent enough to kick in a door, attack Yeardley, steal her laptop, and walk back to his apartment. The jury deliberated for about 9 hours over 2 days. On February 22, 2012, they came back with a verdict. George Huguely was found guilty of second-degree murder, not first-degree. The jury didn't believe the prosecution had proven premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt, but they absolutely believed he was responsible for Yeardley's death. George was also convicted of grand larceny for stealing Yeardley's computer. The verdict was devastating for Yeardley's family. Sharon Love had been hoping for a first-degree conviction. In victim impact statements given before sentencing, Yeardley's family described the pain of losing her. In April 2012, Judge Hogsher sentenced George Huguely to 23 years in prison for second-degree murder and 2 years for grand larceny. To run concurrently, George's family began the appeals process. In 2014, the Virginia Court of Appeals upheld George's conviction. In 2015, the Virginia Supreme Court also upheld the conviction unanimously. George Huguely remains in prison today. According to the Virginia Department of Corrections website, he's currently housed at the Keene Mountain Correctional Center in Oakwood, Virginia. His projected release date is sometime in 2033. He'll be in his mid-40s when he gets out, but he'll still have a life when he gets out. Yeardley Love will never get that chance. In 2012, Yeardley's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against George in civil court. In 2015, a jury found George liable for Yeardley's death and awarded her family $15 million in damages. But Yeardley's family didn't let her death be in vain. Sharon Love founded the One Love Foundation in 2010, shortly after Yeardley's death. The organization's mission is to educate young people about the warning signs of relationship violence and to help them understand what healthy relationships look like. They created educational programs that have reached millions of students across the country. The foundation created a short film called Escalation that shows how relationship violence progresses. They developed educational materials that talk about the warning signs of abuse: intense jealousy, isolation from friends and family, explosive temper, possessiveness, volatility, and belittling behavior. All the red flags that were present in George and Yeardley's relationship. The One Love Foundation has become one of the leading voices in relationship violence education. They work with college campuses, high schools, community groups, and corporations. Many schools now show the foundation's film as part of freshman orientation. Athletic departments have incorporated the foundation's materials into their training for student athletes. One of the foundation's most powerful tools is their 10 Signs framework, which outlines 10 warning signs of an unhealthy relationship: intensity, jealousy, manipulation, isolation, sabotage, belittling, guilting, volatility, deflecting responsibility, and betrayal. The foundation also addresses the role of bystanders. Friends often see the warning signs of an abusive relationship before the victim fully recognizes them. The foundation teaches people how to have difficult conversations with friends about their relationships. One of the most haunting aspects of this case is how many people knew something was wrong but didn't know how to intervene effectively. Yeardley's friends knew George was possessive and controlling. They knew about at least one incident of physical violence, but they didn't report it to authorities. George's teammates knew he had a drinking problem and a temper, but they didn't do anything to stop him. This is one of the biggest challenges with relationship violence, especially among young people. The warning signs are often visible to others, but people don't know what to do with that information. Yeardley told her friends not to report the 2009 incident. She made excuses for George's behavior, and by the time she realized how dangerous he really was, it was too late. The University of Virginia made significant changes after Yeardley's death. They implemented mandatory training for all students on relationship violence and sexual assault. They created new reporting mechanisms. They strengthened their athletic department's policies around student conduct. The men's lacrosse program instituted zero-tolerance policies for violence and abuse research into college. Relationship violence has shown that approximately 1 in 3 college women will experience some form of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse in a dating relationship. The warning signs of an abusive relationship were all present in George and Yeardley's relationship. These signs escalate over time, which is exactly what happened. It started with emotional abuse and control, moved to a physical altercation, and eventually ended in her death. One of the most dangerous times for a victim of relationship violence is when they try to leave the relationship. Statistics show that the period right after a breakup is when victims are at the highest risk of being harmed or killed by their abuser. This is exactly what happened to Yeardley. She finally got the strength to leave George, to move on with her life. And that's when he attacked her. Yeardley's case highlights the specific challenges of relationship violence among college students. Young people in their late teens and early 20s are still developing emotionally. They often lack the life experience to recognize unhealthy relationship patterns. They're dealing with the stress of academic pressure, social dynamics, and newfound independence. They're often drinking heavily, which impairs judgment. All of these factors create an environment where relationship violence can flourish. George came from a wealthy family. He was a Division I athlete at a prestigious university. He'd spent his whole life in environments where he was special, where the rules were different for him. When he got in trouble in Lexington for resisting arrest, his family hired lawyers and fought the charges. When he was violent with Yeardley, there were no immediate consequences. He'd learned that he could behave badly and get away with it. That sense of entitlement extended to his relationship with Yeardley. When she tried to move on, he couldn't accept it. His actions were about control. Sharon Love has traveled around the country speaking to students, parents, educators, and community groups about relationship violence. She's shared Yeardley's story countless times, even though it's painful, because she knows it can save lives. The foundation teaches young people to recognize the warning signs. They teach them how to have difficult conversations. They emphasize the importance of believing victims when they share their experiences. The foundation has also worked to change the conversation around masculinity and violence. The foundation's programs help young men understand that real strength comes from respecting boundaries, communicating effectively, and handling emotions in healthy ways. There's also been increased attention to the role of alcohol in relationship violence. George was extremely intoxicated when he attacked Yeardley, and alcohol played a role in many of their previous conflicts. Yeardley Love would have turned 37 years old this year. She should be living her life, working in a career she loves, maybe married with children. Her mother should be a grandmother. Her sister should still have her best friend. All of that was taken from them by George Huguely's violence. But in a meaningful way, Yeardley's impact has also touched millions of people who never met her. Through the One Love Foundation, her story has been used to educate young people about relationship violence. Sharon Love has taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and transformed it into a force for good in the world. The University of Virginia created the Yeardley Reynolds Love Scholarship, which is awarded annually to a female student-athlete who demonstrates leadership. The women's lacrosse team holds an annual game in Yeardley's honor. Every year, lacrosse teams across the country participate in One Love games to raise awareness about relationship violence. The case raises important questions about how we raise boys and young men in our society. George wasn't born with these tendencies. He learned those behaviors somewhere. Breaking these patterns requires a cultural shift in how we socialize boys from a young age. There's also the question of early intervention. George showed warning signs of concerning behavior long before he attacked Yeardley. But everyone who had the power to intervene chose not to. What's clear is that Yeardley Love's death was preventable. If George had gotten treatment for his alcohol abuse and anger problems earlier, if the university had taken the 2009 incident seriously and intervened, if George's teammates had reported his concerning behavior, if Yeardley's friends had pushed harder for her to report the abuse, if the criminal justice system had moved faster on George's Lexington arrest, any one of these interventions might have changed the outcome. Education is the key to prevention. The One Love Foundation and other organizations are working to change the culture around relationship violence. They're teaching young people to recognize the warning signs. They're giving victims the language to describe what's happening to them. They're empowering bystanders to speak up when they see concerning behavior. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, on average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. That's more than 10 million women and men per year. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience severe intimate partner physical violence. The warning signs of relationship violence are consistent across cases. Jealousy and possessiveness are often the first red flags. An abuser may constantly check their partner's phone, demand to know where they are at all times, or become angry when their partner spends time with friends. They may isolate their partner from support systems. They may use verbal abuse or humiliation to control their partner. And eventually, in many cases, the abuse becomes physical. But leaving is the most dangerous time. When a victim finally decides to end an abusive relationship, the abuser often escalates their violence because they're losing control. This is when victims are most likely to be seriously injured or killed. Yeardley Love tried to leave George Huguely. She broke up with him. She was moving on with her life. And that's when he attacked her. The One Love Foundation teaches specific bystander intervention strategies. They teach people how to recognize warning signs. They teach them how to have difficult conversations with friends about their relationships. They teach them when and how to escalate concerns to authorities. The foundation also emphasizes the importance of believing victims when they disclose abuse. If you or someone you know is experiencing relationship violence, please reach out. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START to 887-888 or chat online at thehotline.org. One Love Foundation has extensive resources on their website at joinonlove.org. If you're in immediate danger, call 911, and if this story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Have conversations with your friends, your children, your students about what healthy relationships look like. Learn the warning signs of abuse and commit to speaking up when you see them. Support organizations like the One Love Foundation that are working to prevent these tragedies. That's how we prevent future tragedies. That's how we ensure that Yeardley's death wasn't in vain. Yeardley Love was 22 years old when she died. She was 3 weeks away from graduating from college. She was kind, funny, loyal, and loved by everyone who knew her. She deserved to live. She deserved to achieve her dreams. George Huguely took all of that away from her because he couldn't handle the fact that she'd moved on with her life. But her mother has worked tirelessly to ensure that Yeardley's legacy is about more than just being a victim. Through the One Love Foundation, Yeardley has become a symbol of hope, of education, of prevention. Her story has saved lives. And that's something worth remembering. This has been Accused. I'll see you in the next case.